It's the 11th of January 1944, a bitter winter day over central Germany. Snow covers the ground far below, and heavy clouds choke the sky, making visibility a nightmare. Just after 11 a.m., Major James H. Howard, commander of the 356th Fighter Squadron in the 354th Fighter Group, is flying his P-51B Mustang, Ding Hao, one of the first operational Mustangs in the European theatre. He's leading a small force of about 44 to 49 P-51 seconds from the Pioneer Mustang Group, escorting a massive 8th Air Force raid mission 182 deep into Nazi territory. The target, aircraft factories in Oschersleben, Halberstadt and Brunswick. The weather is brutal. Many groups abort due to icing and murk, but the 1st Bomb Division presses on with their B-17 flying fortresses. Howard's squadron gets scattered in the clouds during the approach. Suddenly, he's separated from his wingmen, alone at altitude, looking down on roughly 60 B-17 seconds from the 401st Bomb Group. They're under savage assault 30 to 40 Luftwaffe fighters, a deadly mix of single-engine Focke-Wulf FW-190 seconds and twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf-110 seconds, diving in waves, guns blazing. Howard doesn't wait for backup. He rolls his Mustang inverted, dives straight into the fight, and turns his aircraft into a one-man shield. For the next half hour, he weaves through the formation, making aggressive passes, his 6 .50 caliber guns hammering away. He confirms 3 kills, a Bf-110 and 2 Fo-190 seconds, damages several more, and forces the attackers to break off again and again. 3 of his guns jam early, his fuel is critically low, and he's flying through flak and enemy tracers, but he keeps pressing. Bomber crews below watch in disbelief as this lone Mustang pilot repeatedly positions himself between them and the Germans, buying them precious time to drop their bombs and head for home. Colonel Harold W. Bowman, the 401st commander, later calls it the work of a one-man air force. Crew members describe Howard's Mustang darting in and out, trailing smoke from enemy planes, saving their group from what could have been catastrophic losses. His actions earn him the Medal of Honor, the only fighter pilot awarded it in the entire European air campaign, presented later by General Karl Spaatz in London. Now shift perspective to the German side. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock, a veteran pilot with Echo, Jagdgeschwader 11, is climbing in his Bf-109G, leading his unit to intercept the incoming Americans. For Nock and his fellow Luftwaffe flyers, this is routine. Let the short-range U.S. escorts like P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings burn their fuel and turn back near the border, then slam the unprotected bombers. It's worked brutally well. Schweinfurt, in October 1943 alone, cost the Americans 60 heavies in a single day. But today feels different. As Nock closes on the bombers, he spots unfamiliar shapes, sleek, single-engine fighters with long noses, bubble canopies, and smooth laminar flow wings. These aren't the stocky P-47 seconds or twin-boom P-38 seconds. They're P-51 Mustangs, and they're not peeling off. Nock later records the shock in his diary. "We went after the bombers as usual. Then these new American fighters appeared. They stayed with us through every maneuver. When we tried to disengage, they followed us down. I've never seen anything like them." The Germans dive to escape, expecting their superior roll rate or climb to save them, but the Mustangs match or exceed them in speed at altitude up to 440 miles per hour and keep the pressure on. No quick hit and run today. The hunters are suddenly the hunted. This single mission wasn't the end of the air war, but it was the unmistakable beginning of the end for Luftwaffe dominance. Amid the chaos of Mission 1, 82663 bombers dispatched, fierce opposition from an estimated 500 German fighters, 60 American heavies lost, yet claims of 174 enemy aircraft down the P-51 proved it could go deep, stay long, and fight hard. For the first time, American bombers had real protection all the way to the target and back. To grasp why this day hit so hard, we need to step back and see the air campaign as it stood in late 1943, when the Luftwaffe still held the upper hand over German skies. To understand why January 11, Itenjo by Sea, felt like a thunderclap to both American and German airmen, we have to go back to the grim months of 1943, when the air war over Europe was still very much in Germany's favor. The U.S. 8th Air Force had arrived in England in mid-1942, but by the summer of 1943, it was clear that daylight precision bombing of Germany was going to be far more costly than anyone had predicted. The doctrine was simple: bomb by day, hit the target accurately, and rely on the defensive firepower of the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator to fight off interceptors. But the Luftwaffe had learned how to exploit the one glaring weakness in that plan: the limited range of American escort fighters. The P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning were tough, fast, and heavily armed, but they could only stay with the bombers for about 2 to 3 hours before fuel forced them to turn back, usually just as they reached the German border or the western edge of the Reich. Once the escorts peeled off, the bombers were on their own. The Luftwaffe's fighters, Bf 109 seconds and W 190 seconds, would wait at altitude, then pounce in coordinated waves. They could make 1 or 2 quick passes, inflict heavy damage, and then dive away to safety, using their superior roll rate or climb to escape before the bombers' gunners could get a good shot. This tactic worked with devastating effect. On the 17th of August 1943, the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission cost 60 B-17 seconds, nearly a quarter of the attacking force. 2 months later, on October 14, the second Schweinfurt raid was even worse. 60 bombers lost again, and many more damaged beyond repair. Crews began calling it Black Thursday. The loss rate on deep penetrations sometimes climbed above 10%, unsustainable over the long haul. A typical bomber crew had to complete 25 missions to rotate home, but at those rates, the odds of survival were close to zero. For the Luftwaffe, these victories were proof of their superiority. German propaganda constantly reminded pilots that they were flying the best aircraft in the world, led by the best trained and most experienced flyers. And in 1943, there was a lot of truth to that. Many Luftwaffe aces had hundreds of kills from the Eastern Front and the Battle of Britain, while new American pilots were arriving with only a few hundred hours in the air. Yet the Germans weren't resting on their laurels. They experimented with new tactics, dropping small bombs on bomber formations from above, using rocket-armed Bf 110 seconds, even trying to ram enemy aircraft. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock himself pioneered some of these ideas, including a technique where Bf 109 seconds would release 250 kg bombs into the middle of a bomber box. But the real advantage was still the same. The Luftwaffe could choose when and where to fight, and they could always disengage on their terms. By late 1943, American bomber losses were mounting so fast that the entire strategic bombing campaign was in jeopardy. The brass in Washington and London knew they had to solve the escort problem fast, or the daylight offensive would have to be scaled back or abandoned. They needed a fighter that could go deep, stay long, and hold its own against the best the Luftwaffe could throw at it. Enter the North American P-51 Mustang. The Mustang had been flying with the RAF since 1942, but it was the marriage of the airframe with the British-designed Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that turned it into a true long-range fighter. With drop tanks, the P-51B could fly more than 1,650 miles, enough to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, with fuel left for combat. At 25,000 feet and above, it could hit 440 miles per hour, outpace both the Bf 109G and Fu 190A in level flight, and maintain that speed without overheating. Its laminar flow wing gave it excellent acceleration in dives, and the bubble canopy offered superb visibility. The 354th Fighter Group, the first American unit to receive the P-51B in combat, had been training with the new fighter since late 1943. They called themselves the Pioneer Mustang Group and were eager to prove what this aircraft could do. On the 11th of January 1944, they finally got their chance. That day, amid the snow and clouds over central Germany, the old rules of the air war were about to be rewritten forever. The morning of the 11th of January 1944 dawned cold and grey across East Anglia. At RAF Boxted, home of the 354th Fighter Group, pilots of the Pioneer Mustang Group climbed into their brand new P-51Bs. These weren't the Allison-powered Mustangs the RAF had flown earlier. These were the Merlin-powered B models, faster, longer-legged, and built for exactly this kind of mission. The 8th Air Force had dispatched Mission 182, 663 heavy bombers, mostly B-17 seconds, with some B-24 seconds targeting critical German aircraft factories at Oschersleben, Halberstadt, and Brunswick. It was a deep strike, well inside the Reich, where short-range escorts had always had to turn back. Weather was the first enemy. Thick, overcast, icing conditions, and scattered snow showers forced many groups to abort. Only the 1st Bomb Division pressed ahead, with roughly 200-250 fortresses reaching the target area. The fighter escort plan called for P-54 Thunderbolts and P-81 Lightnings to cover the bombers to the German border, then hand off to the new Mustangs for the penetration phase. As the bombers droned eastward, the P-47 seconds and P-38 seconds reached their bingo fuel and swung back toward England, exactly as the Luftwaffe expected. German controllers Vektor Jagdgeschwader 11, JG1, JG26, and others to climb and intercept. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock and his comrades in second. JG11 leveled off at around 25,000 feet, spotted the bomber boxes, and began their attack runs. They anticipated the usual, a few quick passes through the formation, heavy damage, then a clean dive to safety. But something was wrong. Nock and his wingmen suddenly saw the new shapes, long-nosed, single-engine fighters with distinctive bubble canopies gliding above and behind the bombers. These weren't the chunky P-47 seconds or the twin-boom P-38 seconds. They were P-51 seconds, and they weren't turning back. The Mustangs had used their 75-gallon drop tanks to stretch their legs all the way to the target. Once over the bombers, many pilots jettisoned the tanks and stayed in the fight, their Merlin engines delivering sustained power without the overheating issues that plagued some German fighters at altitude. At 25,000, 30,000 feet, the P-51B could cruise at 440 miles per hour in level flight faster than the Bf-109G6 or Focke-Wulf 190A5, and it accelerated hard in a dive. The laminar flow wing helped it maintain energy, and the bubble canopy gave pilots unmatched situational awareness. The first clashes were brutal and one-sided in ways the Germans hadn't anticipated. Major James H. Howard's solo stand became the most famous moment of the day. Separated from his squadron in the clouds, he spotted the 401st Bomb Group under heavy attack. For 30 relentless minutes, Howard flew aggressive, head-on passes and high-side attacks, positioning his Mustang repeatedly between the bombers and the attackers. He confirmed 3 kills, 1 Bf-110 and 2 Focke-Wulf 192, damaged at least 4 others, and broke up multiple assault waves even after 3 of his 6. 50 calibers jammed and his fuel gauge was kissing empty. His actions kept the German fighters from concentrating on the bombers, allowing the 401st to bomb accurately and limp home with far fewer losses than they might have suffered. Across the sky, other P-51 pilots from the 354th were doing the same on a smaller scale. They didn't just defend, they pursued. When German fighters tried their signature tactic make a pass, then split S or roll away, and dive, the Mustangs followed. The Bf 109 seconds and Fu 190 seconds could still outroll the Mustang in a quick snap. But roll rate didn't matter when the American fighter could catch you in a shallow dive or sustained chase. The Luftwaffe pilots discovered there was no longer a safe exit. If they engaged, they had to win or risk being run down all the way back toward their own airfields. Nock's diary captures the raw frustration and dawning realization. The new American fighters didn't behave like any escort they had faced before. They stayed, they chased, they didn't run out of gas or patience. For the first time, the Luftwaffe could not dictate the terms of engagement. They could no longer hit and fade with impunity. By the time the bombers turned for home, the mission had cost the 8th Air Force 60 heavies significant, but far from the slaughter of Schweinfurt. American fighter pilots claimed 174 German aircraft destroyed, a figure later adjusted downward in post-war analysis, but still impressive. The Luftwaffe admitted heavy losses that day, and the psychological impact was immediate and profound. Pilots who survived returned to base talking about those damned long-range fighters that wouldn't leave. OT, ID-1. January 11 wasn't the end of the Luftwaffe, but it was the day the balance tipped. The P-51 had proven it could solve the escort riddle, go deep, stay long, and fight effectively. From that moment, the old game, the Luftwaffe's game, was over. What followed was a cascade of changes that would accelerate the destruction of German air power in the West. The P-51 Mustang didn't win the air war with revolutionary new technology or some secret weapon. It was a superb but fundamentally conventional fighter, a lightweight airframe, 6 50-caliber machine guns, and a powerful engine. What made it decisive was how perfectly it solved the one problem that had plagued the 8th Air Force for over a year, the escort range problem. The key upgrade was the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, license-built in the U.S. as the Packard V1000. 650. Unlike the earlier Allison-powered Mustangs, the Merlin delivered full power at high altitude without losing performance as the air thinned out. At 25,000 feet and above the altitudes where most bomber battles were fought, the P-51B could sustain 440 miles per hour in level flight. That was faster than the Bf-109G6, around 410 miles per hour at best, and the FW-195, 6 roughly 408.415 miles per hour. More importantly, it could hold that speed for extended periods without the engine overheating or the pilot having to throttle back. The laminar flow wing was another quiet advantage. It reduced drag and gave the Mustang excellent acceleration in a dive. Once you pointed the nose down, you built speed quickly and could catch a fleeing German fighter before it could level out and escape. The bubble canopy, borrowed from later Spitfire designs, gave the pilot near 360-degree visibility, letting him spot threats early and keep track of the fight. Drop tanks were the final piece. The standard 75-gallon external tanks, sometimes two of them, extended the combat radius dramatically. A P-51B could take off from England, fly deep into Germany, jettison the tanks over the target area, fight for 20-30 minutes, and still have enough internal fuel to get home. Major Howard, in his Medal of Honor action, actually conserved his internal fuel to stay in the fight longer, relying on careful throttle management rather than burning everything early. Compare that to the German fighters. The Bf-109G was nimble at low speeds and could climb like a rocket, but at high altitude its Daimler-Benz engine struggled with supercharger limitations, and it bled energy fast in sustained turns or chases. The 4190 was tougher, with excellent roll rate and firepower, but it was heavier and slower at altitude than the Mustang. In a straight-line pursuit or a prolonged dive chase, the P-51 usually had the edge. Tactically, this translated into an immediate and profound shift. Before the Mustang, American fighters flew a defensive role, stay glued to the bombers, react when attacked, and never stray far for fear of running out of fuel. The P-51's range changed the playbook. Pilots from the 354th and later groups began flying aggressive fighter sweeps ranging ahead of the bomber stream, climbing above anticipated intercept points, and hunting Luftwaffe formations while they were still assembling or climbing to altitude. Instead of waiting for the Germans to strike, the Mustangs struck first. They would bounce enemy fighters on takeoff, catch them in climbs, or chase them back toward their bases after an attack. The psychological reversal was brutal. Luftwaffe pilots who had spent years as predators now had to constantly check their six for those long-nosed shadows that never seemed to run out of gas or ammunition. For the Germans, the most terrifying realization was the loss of safe disengagement. Their entire doctrine relied on hit and run. Make a pass, inflict damage, then dive or roll away to safety. With P-51 seconds willing and able to pursue, that option vanished. A pilot who broke off combat now risked being tailed for miles, caught in a vulnerable low-speed turn near his airfield, or simply run out of altitude and energy while trying to escape. Oberleutnant Noak and others quickly adapted survival tactics, refused combat unless the odds were overwhelmingly in their favor, break off at the first sign of Mustangs, and prioritize living to fight another day over pressing home an attack on bombers. It was rational, but it meant the Luftwaffe was ceding control of German airspace. Bombers could now fly through with far less interference, and the pressure on German industry and cities began to mount without respite. The mission on January 11 cost the 8th Air Force 60 bombers a heavy price, but the Luftwaffe suffered proportionally worse. American claims reached 174. Destroyed post-war analysis puts the actual figure closer to 100-120, still a serious blow, and many more were damaged or forced to abort. The real damage, though, was strategic and psychological. The Luftwaffe could no longer fight on its own terms. In the weeks and months that followed, this single tactical innovation, combined with the Mustangs' growing numbers, would trigger a cascade of losses the Germans could not replace. The air war over Europe had entered its final, decisive phase. The events of the 11th of January 1944 didn't end the air war overnight, but they set off a chain reaction that accelerated the Luftwaffe's collapse faster than almost anyone expected. The Mustang's ability to stay with the bombers all the way in and all the way out fundamentally altered the rules of engagement, and the consequences unfolded rapidly in the weeks and months that followed. Tactically, the 8th Air Force shifted from a purely defensive posture to aggressive offense. With the P-51's long legs up to 1,650 miles with drop tanks, fighter groups no longer had to hug the bomber boxes like bodyguards. They could fly fighter sweeps far ahead, climbing to altitude where German interceptors were most vulnerable, during takeoff, climb out, or assembly over their fields. Mustangs would bounce enemy formations before they could even reach the bombers, forcing the Luftwaffe to scatter, abort, or fight on American terms. This hunter-killer role turned the tables completely. The Predators of 1,943 became the prey in 1944. For Luftwaffe pilots, the change was immediate and terrifying. Survival became the priority. Veterans like Heinz Noak began refusing combat unless the odds were heavily stacked in their favor. If a Mustang appeared on the scene, many broke off early, dove for the deck, or simply avoided the fight altogether. It was smart self-preservation, but it meant the bombers flew through German airspace with steadily decreasing opposition. By spring 1944, American heavies could strike targets across the Reich with manageable losses and increasing impunity. The numbers tell the brutal story of attrition. In January 1944, Luftwaffe fighter losses on the Western Front were around 280 aircraft. By February, they jumped higher, and March saw monthly figures exceeding 450. The real hammer blow came in late February with Operation Argument, better known as Big Week. From February 20 to 25, the 8th Air Force, joined by the 15th and RAF Bomber Command, launched a massive, sustained assault on German aircraft factories, engine plants, and ball bearing works. Over 6 days, Allied forces flew thousands of sorties, dropping more bombs than in the entire previous year in some sectors. The cost was high. The 8th lost about 226 heavy bombers and 28 fighters, with over 2,000 airmen killed or captured. But the Luftwaffe paid far worse. They lost around 262 fighters. Some sources put it closer to 250-300 inches the week alone, including nearly 100 experienced pilots killed. Big Week set German aircraft production back by 2 months and gutted frontline fighter units, especially the twin-engine Zerstörer groups like Bf 110 seconds and Me 410 seconds, which proved easy prey for Mustangs. The operation marked the first time the Luftwaffe couldn't mount effective defense against deep penetrations. Throughout 1944, the pattern held. While German factories ramped up production output actually peaked in some months, they couldn't replace the pilots fast enough. Experienced aces were being shot down or worn out at rates the training pipeline couldn't match. By early 1944, new Luftwaffe fighter pilots were entering combat with roughly 160 hours of total flight time, sometimes as low as 112-120 hours later in the year. Many had minimal time on operational types like the Bf 109 or Fu 190 before being thrown into the meat grinder. Contrast that with American pilots. USAAF fighter trainees typically accumulated 400+ hours before combat deployment, including extensive gunnery, formation flying, and combat tactics in stateside schools. The experience gap was massive. A veteran P-51 pilot with hundreds of hours and multiple missions could dominate a green German replacement in almost any engagement. The Mustang's performance advantages, speed, dive, acceleration, sustained power, amplified this disparity into slaughter in many cases. German technical countermeasures came too little, too late. The Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter entered limited service in late 1944 and could outrun Mustangs with devastating 30mm cannon firepower. But production delays, chronic fuel shortages, Hitler's insistence on using it as a bomber, and constant Allied attacks on airfields meant only about 200-300 Me 262 seconds ever saw combat nowhere near enough to reverse the tide. By March and April 1944, most 8th Air Force fighter groups had transitioned to the P-51. The Mustang became the dominant long-range escort, flying sweeps that cleared the skies ahead of the bombers. German cities and industries faced round-the-clock hammering with reduced fighter interference. The Luftwaffe was still fighting, still inflicting losses, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The air superiority needed for D-Day in June was being forged in these winter and spring battles, and the P-51 was the key tool. The Mustang didn't win alone through sheer superiority in every dogfight. A skilled Bf 109 pilot could still hold his own under the right conditions. It won by erasing the Luftwaffe's core advantage, the ability to control when, where, and how long to fight. Once that was gone, the slow bleed turned into a hemorrhage the Germans couldn't staunch. As the war dragged into 1945, the statistics became stark. Luftwaffe fighter losses on the Western Front in 1944 exceeded 6,000 aircraft, compared to around 2,400 inches 1,943. The 8th Air Force, despite flying far more deep missions, saw bomber losses stabilize or even drop as a percentage. The path to VE Day was paved in these skies, and it started with that snowy day over Oschersleben. In the end, the P-51 Mustang didn't win the air war through overwhelming technological superiority or some dramatic leap forward. It wasn't a jet, it didn't carry revolutionary radar or guided missiles. And in a straight-up, one-on-one dogfight at low altitude with a top-tier German pilot in a well-maintained Bf 109 or Fu 190, the outcome could still go either way. What made the Mustang the decisive weapon was far simpler, yet infinitely more powerful. It could go anywhere the bombers needed to go, stay there as long as they needed protection, and fight effectively when it got there. That single capability, long-range escort with sustained combat performance, stripped away the Luftwaffe's most cherished advantage, control of the battle. For nearly 2 years, German pilots had chosen the time, the place, and the duration of every engagement. They could strike hard, inflict maximum damage, and then disengage at will, preserving their aircraft and their lives for the next fight. The P-51 erased that freedom. Once the Mustangs appeared overhead, there was no safe exit. No more hit and fade. No more diving away to regroup. If a German pilot committed to an attack on the bombers, he now had to win the fight outright or face the very real chance of being chased down, cornered, and destroyed on the way home. The psychological impact was devastating. Luftwaffe veterans who had survived the Battle of Britain, the Eastern Front, and the early 8th Air Force raids suddenly found themselves in a new reality. Many described the arrival of the Mustang as the moment they knew the war in the air was lost, not that day, not even that month, but inevitably. Oberleutnant Heinz Noack, whose diary captured so much of the shock on January 11, later reflected in his post-war writings that when he saw those new American fighters refuse to turn back and pursue his comrades relentlessly, the certainty of eventual defeat settled in. Johannes Steinhoff, another high-scoring Luftwaffe ace who survived into the jet age, put it even more starkly. The P-51 was the weapon that broke the Luftwaffe's back. Not because it was so superior, though it was excellent, but because it meant we had to fight over Germany, over our own cities, every day with no rest. That wore us down more than anything. For the American side, the change was equally profound. Bomber crews who had faced near-certain death on deep missions suddenly had a realistic chance of completing their 25 mission tours. Loss rates on long penetrations dropped from the unsustainable 5–10% range to a more manageable 2–4% on average. Crews could fly with hope instead of fatalism. Fighter pilots, freed from the rigid little friend escort role, embraced the offensive sweeps that cleared the path ahead and hunted the hunters. By March 1944, the transition was nearly complete. Most 8th Air Force fighter groups had re-equipped with P-51 seconds. The numbers grew rapidly, and the Mustang became the dominant long-range escort across the European theatre. The air superiority it helped create was critical for the success of D-Day in June and the subsequent breakout across France. Without it, the strategic bombing campaign might have faltered, delaying or even jeopardizing the entire Allied invasion plan. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the statistics painted a clear picture of the Mustang's impact. The 8th Air Force lost roughly 2,100 heavy bombers in 1944, despite flying far more missions and penetrating much deeper into Germany than in 1943, when losses were about 1,850. Meanwhile, Luftwaffe fighter losses on the Western Front exploded from around 2,400 inches 1,943 to more than 6,000 inches 1,944. The German pilot training system collapsed under the strain. Inexperienced replacements poured in with barely enough hours to take off and land, only to be met by veteran American flyers in superior machines. The 11th of January 1944, over the snow-covered fields of Oschersleben and Brunswick, was not the final battle. The Luftwaffe fought on for another 16 months, inflicting painful losses right up to the end. But that day marked the unmistakable turning point. When German pilots tried to break away from those relentless, long-nosed fighters and discovered they couldn't, the old order in the skies was finished. The P-51 Mustang proved that sometimes the most decisive weapon isn't the one with the biggest gun or the fastest speed in a single snapshot. It's the one that changes the fundamental rules of the game. It could go anywhere, it could stay there, and that was enough. It was enough to break the Luftwaffe. It was enough to help win the war in the air. And it started on a cold, cloudy morning in central Germany when a handful of Mustangs refused to turn back.